Welcome back to True Crime and Tea, or welcome to True Crime and Tea if this is your first time here. I am Lily, and on True Crime and Tea we explore the darkest corners of human behaviour with empathy, nuance and commitment to ethical storytelling. Today's case is one of the most chilling and controversial cases in global criminal history. Today we are going to be looking at the story of Pedro Alonso Lopez, often called the monster of the Andes. Lopez is believed to be one of the most prolific serial killers in recorded history, so of all times, with his confirmed victims being in the triple digits. Yes, I said confirmed, and claims to have committed 300 homicides across Colombia, Ecuador and Peru. But behind the headlines lies a story shaped by extreme childhood trauma. Yes, we are there again, because most of these cases are steeped in trauma of the childhood, systemic failures again, and international legal complexities that still leave some unanswered questions today. So, grab your tea. I do have tea. If anyone watched my last video, they know that I'm batch recording, so I'm still on the latte. But grab your tea or your coffee, whatever beverage you're drinking today, and let's unpack the life, crimes, psychology, and unresolved mysteries surrounding Pedro Alonso Lopez. Pedro Alonso Lopez was born on October the 5th, 1948 in Tolima, Colombia. He was the seventh of 13 children, raised by a mother who worked as a laundry worker and, according to Lopez, engaged in lady of the night work. That is not confirmed, but this is what Lopez has said about his mother. His father was murdered before he was born during Colombia's civil conflict known as La Violencia. Now, with most of these cases, I think that I've done maybe 3 cases where there wasn't any childhood trauma, but this was a childhood marked by instability, violence, and neglect. Lopez claimed that he witnessed his mother and stepfather having relations in front of him, and neighbors described the household as strict and emotionally cold. So not only are they being extraordinarily explicit in front of the children, they're also not being loving to the children if the household is described as cold. But we do know what the neighbors see on the outside is not necessarily what's happening on the inside, so just saying. At the age of 8, Lopez reported early sexual experiences, including incest. And shortly after, he was abducted and abused by a man who held him captive. In retaliation, Lopez later returned with other children and killed the abuser. Now, I'm not gonna say that I don't agree with that outcome. I'm gonna leave that to you to tussle that out in the comments, because this person abducted these children, essayed these children, and the children went back and vengeance was theirs. I know the Lord says vengeance is mine, but the children were like, no, vengeance is ours today. However, this early act of violence resulted in minimal consequences, reportedly due to his age and traumatic background. Again, do I think the courts made the right decision? I mean, the man's not going to harm any more children now, so there was a case, actually, I might cover it, where the son was abducted. The abductor did things to the child. Then the child was returned to the parents, and then the dad, during the court appearance, waited out in the lobby with a pew, a bit like the Marianne Bruchmeyer case, waited outside with a pew, and the judge basically gave him probation because he was like, well, I don't see you doing it again. I mean, that obviously wasn't a case for Lopez because we know why we're here. However, sometimes justice is served swiftly and efficiently. Anyways, this is a critical moment in his development trajectory. This instance of violence and no punishment or repercussion then is a very important cross-section. We have early sexualization, violent victimization, and a I can't say these big words. A retaliatory killing with no meaningful intervention. In other words, they retaliated and nothing was really done about it. These are the kinds of experiences that criminologists identify as high-risk cursors for later violent offending. As a teenager, Lopez ran away from home and lived on the streets. He was eventually imprisoned for car theft in Colombia. Life in prison was brutal. He was repeatedly essayed by other inmates, and in response, he then killed 3 of his attackers. However, instead of receiving psychological treatment or any form of treatment and support, Lopez's sentence was actually extended. He emerged from prison angrier, more violent, and deeply resentful towards women, which surprises me because it was the men that were doing things to him in the prison. However, unlike the previous case where the criminal got a couple months in prison, this is the other extreme where support should have been given to Lopez. It wasn't, and he was further punished for his actions. I'm not saying he shouldn't have been punished because he committed crimes. He killed people in prison. However, there was no support for what had happened to him whilst he was in there, because again, these seem like retaliatory actions. Someone harmed me, so therefore I'm going to do the same thing to you. So we could say that this is another systemic failure. A young man with a history of trauma, abuse and violence was placed in an environment that reinforced aggression rather than addressing it. They didn't actually look at the root cause, which was him being assaulted by other inmates, and treat the root cause, maybe by isolation. I don't know if that's a thing in Colombian prisons, but they just kind of, oh yeah, you've been harmed, nothing really's happened about that, but then you killed someone else, so you're gonna have to spend longer in this place continuing to be harmed. So it's kind of like a vicious cycle in this case. After his release, Lopez traveled through Peru, Ecuador and Colombia between 1978 and 1980. He targeted young girls, often between the ages of 8 and 12, from impoverished or rural communities. I, again, don't understand why it's the female, but I think, is this partially because that's the only person that he could really overpower? Question for the audience. He lured his victims away, assaulted them and killed them, often burying them in clusters. His crimes often went unnoticed for years. This was due to a lack of coordinated law enforcement across borders, high rates of missing children in impoverished regions, so there was already high rates of missing children, limited investigative resources, and social invisibility of rural girls. Lopez later claimed that he killed over 300 victims. However, through investigations, it has been confirmed to be at least 110. So we're not quite hitting the 300. However, we're in triple digits now. We're not going to detail the violence because, one, we'll be here forever. If we was to look at, what case was it that I looked at? Andre, what was his surname? Can't remember his surname. This video, 56 cases, and I think I picked 19 to go through. It's too many. We are not going to detail the violence in this video. But what matters here is the patterns. The pattern that Lopez preyed on: vulnerability, invisibility, and systemic neglect. In 1980, Lopez was finally caught in Ecuador after a young girl escaped and alerted authorities. During interrogation, Lopez, confessed freely, just admitted to everything. He was almost proud with his confession, and he confessed to killing hundreds of girls. Initially, I don't know why, but police were skeptical. Now, the girl has already gone and said this man did this. He's admitted to it, but police were still skeptical until he led them to mass burial sites containing dozens of his victims. Because remember, he buried them in clusters. And obviously now they're accepting that this man is who he says he is. He became known as the monster of the Andes. Despite the scale of his crimes, though, this is where it gets very interesting, and we can kind of say systemic failure, but we kind of can't. Ecuador's maximum sentence at the time was 16 years for admitting to killing over 110 people. Wild. And did he serve 16 years? No, he served 14. I know that's only 2 years shy, but it's still 2 years too less. Do you understand what I mean? 16 years was the maximum. He served 14 years. After serving his sentence in Ecuador, Pedro was then deported to Colombia in 1994. And this is where he was committed to a psychiatric hospital. However, he was released from the psychiatric hospital in 1998 after being declared rehabilitated. In 1999, Pedro Alonso López disappeared after failing to appear in court for a new charge. So yes, this man did not stop after he was released as rehabilitated. In 1999, he was due to appear in court because he had done something else wrong, and he did not show up, and he is poofed into the wind. His current whereabouts remains unknown. Now, when I did this research, there was a lot of conflicting information. So everything from this point forward, I'm going to say is alleged, it's assumption, it's a theory, because there is nowhere that I could find concrete evidence. This is what happened to Pedro Alonso Lopez. I don't know. So one of the theories is that he returned to Ecuador. We've got that he's resumed his homicidal behavior. He may have traveled to the United States of America, or he may just have died anonymously, as in he died as a John Doe and nobody knew who this man was. And I'm going to assume this is because they don't keep fingerprint records to find out who he is, or maybe they didn't check that. I don't know, but that was one of the concepts, is that he died and just don't know that who he is. But there isn't any confirmed evidence of his death. I also saw that in one of the cases that he was tried for, he was convicted. I think this was in Colombia. He was convicted and was sentenced to death, and was supposed to be executed via firing squad. But again, I don't know if that is fact, because I could not find anywhere that confirmed whether this man was alive or dead or in prison, or alive would be in prison, but alive or dead, and what he was currently doing with his life. So yeah, he could be wandering the streets of the United States of America, or he could be 6 feet under. I don't know. But let's think about this through an academic lens. Now, Lopez's early life included parental neglect, exposure to sexual activity, SA, violent retaliation, and lack of intervention. Research shows that early trauma does not cause serial offending. We know this because a lot of people are raised in some of the most horrendous of conditions and end up being some of the most amazing people. So that is not what causes serial offending, but it can distort attachment, empathy development, emotional regulation, and sexual boundaries. With, again, the subjective concept of the sociopath, it is environmental. So these people become emotionally detached. However, they are a creation of their childhood. Their childhood creates the monster, so to speak. So Lopez's trajectory reflects a pattern where trauma was never addressed. It was only compounded. And you can argue that, well, given the time that this happened in, the 80s, and given the community that he was raised in, why would this trauma be addressed? Because some of these things were seen as the norm, not the sexual exploitation, but like the lack of affection from the parents and the kind of young, what people would call abuse, but it was probably like spanking and stuff. I don't know. But when you look at some of the communities and the time that it was in, you could argue that of course the trauma wasn't addressed, because that kind of thing was never spoken about back then. However, Lopez did exploit the weak law enforcement coordination, rural poverty, definitely, limited reporting mechanisms, and social invisibility. That's kind of linked with, the social invisibility of the victims is linked with the rural poverty. He's effectively an opportunistic serial offender, and his crimes highlight how structural inequalities create opportunities for these behaviors to be successful. Because there was so much going on in these communities at the time, we spoken about the fact that some of these communities already had a large number of missing girls. Why would they all of a sudden pay attention to a couple of those girls in the community? Because it's almost like the norm. So you can argue that these crimes make it very glaringly obvious how structural inequality does create opportunities for people like Lopez to be successful criminals. Lopez is another one that blamed women, especially his mother, for his suffering. The last video I did about Jerry Brudos, he was another one that blamed women for his suffering. So because of this blame game, he referred to his victims using very misogynistic slurs. He did not speak very positively about women, which, okay, I understand his mother, that's the matriarch that should be protecting him. But I would also argue that what happened to him when he was locked up in prison would argue that it was not women that were responsible for his suffering. He just chose to make women responsible for his suffering because it wasn't them that was abusing him while he was in prison. However, this idea of women being responsible for his suffering aligns with patterns of gender-based violence where women are dehumanized. I'm going to swap out women for girls because he did not attack women. So already that argument kind of falls on its head, because it was the girls that were dehumanized. And violence becomes symbolic retaliation. He's retaliating against females because he thinks that they're responsible for his suffering. And then also, victims are often chosen for accessibility, not for connection. He chose 8 to 12-year-old girls because they were easy to abduct. I'm going to call hypocrisy here because he was also a child that was abducted and essayed. So you would think that trauma would make you more desiring to be a representative for those communities as opposed to a predator of those communities. However, he wasn't, unfortunately. And Lopez targeted girls from marginalized communities, the invisible communities. Their disappearances were often dismissed as runaways, migration, or family issues. Lopez himself ran away from home and lived on the streets. So he already knew what it was like to be a runaway. He already knew what it was like to not have anybody look for you. And he exploited that fact, especially in a time where women weren't really or girls weren't really looked after. Their safety wasn't of the utmost importance. So he exploited the fact, knowing what it was like to be a runaway and living on the streets, and knowing what the response to that would be from law enforcement and the families that were in those rural communities. And this case then exposes how the social inequality shapes victimization. The victims were invisible, therefore they had no voice, and the predator, who was Lopez, again exploited that fact. Ecuador's maximum sentence of 16 years, regardless of victim count, is insane. The fact that he confessed to killing hundreds of people and took them to burial sites of dozens of victims screams systemic failure, right? And what this reflects is the historical sentencing limits and how poor they are, because 16 years, regardless of number, is wild. The lack of serial killer frameworks, because obviously this was an American thing. Serial killers were an American thing. They were the ones that were studying serial killers, not the other societies, so like the Colombians, the Ecuadorians, the Peruvians. They didn't have a framework to look at when it came to serial killers. Also, human rights concerns about harsher penalties. I don't know why any human rights activist would agree with 16 years for killing 110 people, but it still raises that issue of the activism behind it. His release and disappearance then reveal the challenges of cross-border justice. We know that in some instances, when you commit crimes over borders, there is, one state will do their due diligence, and they will do their justice for the victims that were killed in that area. And then, like, he got back to Colombia. Okay, yeah, there was a little bit done, but he didn't go to prison. He went to a mental health facility. So he wasn't actually punished for the crimes that he committed in Colombia. And he was only there for 4 years. So that cross-border justice seems very unjust in this instance. The mental health evaluations and the post-release monitoring also make it glaringly obvious that there were systemic failings, because to have someone admit to killing 300 people, but then evaluated is an inpatient for 4 years and then miraculously appears to be healthy and rehabilitated after 4 years and released, that is wild. But then you can also argue that he is the ultimate manipulator, because he was able to convince them that he was well and he was able to go back into the general population. Now we know that that was not true, because he then continued to commit offences. He was released in 1998. By 1999 he'd committed offences again to be present in court again, just didn't show up. So we know he wasn't rehabilitated. So again, when you look at that situation and these circumstances, you can argue the systemic failure, because somebody was not paying attention to his previous history. Pedro Alonso López's story is not about one man's violence. It's not just about Pedro. It's about the systems that failed to intervene, the communities that lacked protection, and the victims whose lives were cut short and often overlooked. This case reminds us that justice is not just about punishment. It's about prevention, protection, and visibility. It's not just about Lopez being given 4 years. It's about Lopez only being given 4 years and those communities again being unsafe and invisible, because there wasn't the right, in my opinion, justice wasn't served when it came to Pedro Lopez. And the fact that nobody knows, somebody knows, but the public don't really know what happened to Pedro Lopez. Is he alive? Is he dead? Is he in prison? Is he got a family now? And that is it for today's True Crime and Tea. Thank you for spending this time with me today. If you appreciate deep dive, academically grounded, true crime that centers victims and challenges harmful narratives, please make sure to like, subscribe, and turn on that notification bell so you know when a new video is released. And as usual, take care of yourselves, drink some tea or whatever beverage you like to drink. I know people don't like to drink tea actually. And I'll see you in the next video. Okay, bye.